What if I told you that one of history's most infamous betrayers was once considered trustworthy enough to handle Jesus' money? What if the man who sold out the Son of God for 30 pieces of silver had actually been chosen through prayer and divine selection? The story of Judas Iscariot that most people know begins and ends with betrayal. But there's a hidden chapter that reveals something far more unsettling about human nature itself. Before Judas became the ultimate symbol of treachery, he walked dusty roads alongside Jesus, witnessed miracles that defied explanation, and held a position of trust that none of the other disciples questioned. He wasn't some obvious villain lurking in the shadows. He was respected, reliable, and so convincing in his devotion that when Jesus announced one of them would betray him, not a single disciple pointed a finger at Judas. How does someone go from being handpicked by the Messiah to becoming his betrayer? What was happening in Judas's heart during those 3 years that no one else could see? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does his story reveal about the capacity for deception that exists within all of us? If you've ever wondered about the man behind the betrayal, if you've questioned how someone so close to Jesus could fall so far, then you're about to discover truths that have been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years. Comment why if you're ready to uncover the shocking reality of who Judas really was before that fateful night in the garden. Make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because this journey into the secret life of Judas will challenge everything you thought you knew about loyalty, deception, and the human heart. Let's step back in time to a world under Roman occupation, where hope was scarce and revolution simmered beneath the surface, and discover the man who would become history's most notorious traitor. The year was approximately 30 A, and the land of Israel was a powder keg waiting to explode. Roman legions patrolled the streets of Jerusalem while Jewish religious leaders struggled to maintain their authority under foreign rule. It was into this volatile world that a young man named Judas Iscariot stepped into history, carrying with him secrets that would remain hidden until the very end. But who was this man before he became synonymous with betrayal? The first clue lies in his name itself. Judas Iscariot, most scholars believe, means Judas, man of Kerioth, pointing to his hometown of Kerioth, a small village south of Jerusalem in the region of Judah. This seemingly minor detail reveals something profound about Judas's position among the 12 disciples. While the other 11 were from Galilee in the north, Judas was the only Judean among them. Picture this: 11 men who shared the same regional culture, the same accent, the same way of looking at the world, and then there was Judas, the outsider. Galilee and Judea weren't just different regions. They represented different mindsets, different expectations, and different relationships with the Roman occupation. In Judea, closer to the seat of power in Jerusalem, the political tensions were more intense, the desire for liberation more urgent. This geographical divide may seem insignificant to us today, but in first-century Palestine, it would have been like being the only southerner in a group of northerners, or the only city dweller among country folk. Judas would have instantly been marked as not one of us by the other disciples, creating an undercurrent of separation that may have festered throughout his time with Jesus. But there's another theory about his name that's far more chilling. Some scholars suggest that Iscariot might not refer to a place at all, but to a political affiliation. The word bears a striking resemblance to Sicari, which means dagger men in Latin. The Sicari were Jewish assassins who opposed Roman rule, hiding curved daggers under their cloaks and striking down Roman officials and Jewish collaborators in crowded marketplaces before disappearing into the chaos. Could Judas have been a former revolutionary? A man who had once believed that violence was the path to freedom? If so, his decision to follow Jesus takes on an entirely different meaning. Perhaps he saw in this charismatic teacher from Nazareth not a spiritual savior, but a potential military leader who could rally the people and drive out the Romans once and for all. Imagine the disappointment, the growing frustration, as month after month Jesus preached about loving enemies, turning the other cheek, and rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's. For a man who may have once gripped a dagger in service of liberation, watching Jesus heal Roman soldiers and welcome tax collectors would have been agonizing. Yet despite whatever political baggage or cultural alienation Judas may have carried, something remarkable happened. Jesus chose him. Not randomly, not reluctantly, but deliberately and prayerfully. Luke's gospel tells us that before selecting the 12 apostles, Jesus spent an entire night in prayer on a mountain. All night, he communed with the Father about this crucial decision. And when morning came, among the 12 men he called to be his closest companions was Judas Iscariot. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't God being caught off guard. Jesus, who could see into men's hearts, who knew their thoughts before they spoke them, intentionally selected a man he knew would one day betray him. The implications of this are staggering. It means that for 3 years, Jesus looked into the face of his future betrayer every single day, loved him, taught him, and trusted him with responsibilities that the other disciples respected. And what responsibilities they were. Among the 12 apostles, Judas was given perhaps the most sensitive role of all. He was made treasurer. In a group of fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots, Jesus chose Judas to handle the money. Think about what this means. In any organization, the person who controls the finances holds a position of enormous trust and influence. They know where the money comes from, where it goes, and they have access to resources that others don't. The fact that none of the other disciples objected to this appointment tells us something crucial about Judas's public persona. He must have appeared trustworthy, responsible, and capable. Peter might have been impulsive, Thomas might have been doubtful, but Judas seemed steady enough to handle the group's finances. He was the CFO of Jesus' ministry, and everyone thought he was perfect for the job. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. John's gospel reveals a truth that remained hidden from the other disciples throughout their entire time together. Judas was stealing from them. Not just once or twice, but regularly, systematically, as a matter of habit. The Bible doesn't mince words about this. It says he was a thief and that having charge of the money bag he used to help himself to what was put into it. The Greek word used here suggests that this wasn't petty theft or occasional weakness. This was calculated, ongoing embezzlement. For possibly the entire 3 years of Jesus' public ministry, while performing miracles, preaching to crowds, and watching his fellow disciples grow in faith, Judas was quietly lining his own pockets with money intended for ministry and charity. How much money are we talking about? The gospel accounts suggest that Jesus' ministry was far from poverty-stricken. Luke mentions wealthy women who supported them financially. The disciples had enough resources to regularly give to the poor, to purchase supplies for large gatherings, and to maintain a treasury significant enough that skimming from it could go unnoticed by 11 other men. This paints a picture of a substantial operation, not a ragtag group of wandering preachers scraping by on donations. And at the center of it all was Judas, managing resources that would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's economy, all while secretly stealing portions for himself. The most chilling aspect of this deception is how completely he fooled everyone except Jesus. When the other disciples gathered for meals, when they discussed ministry plans, when they worried about finances, Judas sat among them as a trusted brother. His theft was so carefully concealed that even Peter, James, and John, who were closest to Jesus, never suspected anything. This level of deception requires more than just greed. It requires a cold calculation, an ability to look your friends in the eye while robbing them, and a capacity for maintaining a false persona that is truly sociopathic in its completeness. Day after day, Judas heard Jesus teach about honesty, integrity, and serving others. Night after night, he shared meals with men who trusted him completely. And through it all, he was stealing from them. But the money was just the beginning. As we'll discover in the next part of this investigation, Judas's hidden life contained secrets that ran far deeper than financial corruption, and his path to betrayal was paved with deceptions that would shock even those who thought they knew him best. Yet even as Judas systematically robbed his companions, something extraordinary was happening right before his eyes. He wasn't just observing Jesus from a distance like the crowds who followed from town to town. He was witnessing miracles up close, participating in supernatural ministry, and experiencing the very power of God flowing through his own hands. The Gospels make it clear that when Jesus sent out the 12 apostles, Judas was included in that mission. Picture this: the same man who was stealing from the treasury was also casting out demons, healing the sick, and preaching the gospel with divine authority. The irony is staggering. While his heart harbored greed and deception, his hands were instruments of God's miraculous power. How does someone reconcile such contradictions? How do you heal the sick in the morning and steal from your brothers in the evening? How do you cast out demons while harboring your own inner darkness? This wasn't someone who occasionally struggled with temptation. This was a man living a complete double life, maintaining a facade so convincing that it fooled everyone around him. But here's what makes Judas' deception even more remarkable. He wasn't just passively fooling people. He was actively participating in discussions about ministry, offering opinions about how resources should be used, and even expressing concern for the poor. The most revealing glimpse into his character comes during an incident that occurred just days before his betrayal. The scene unfolds in the home of Lazarus, Martha, and Mary in Bethany. Jesus had recently raised Lazarus from the dead, and the family was hosting a dinner in his honor. During the meal, Mary approached Jesus with an alabaster jar containing pure nard, an extremely expensive perfume worth approximately a year's wages. In an act of profound worship and love, she broke the jar and poured the entire contents over Jesus' feet, then wiped them with her hair. The fragrance filled the house, but so did an unexpected voice of protest. It was Judas who spoke up, his words dripping with apparent concern for social justice. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. On the surface, this sounds like the voice of someone deeply concerned about inequality and poverty. Here was a disciple who seemed to understand that resources should be used to help those in need rather than wasted on luxury. But John's Gospel pulls back the curtain on Judas' true motivation with brutal honesty. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. The man who had been systematically stealing from funds intended for charity was now lecturing others about proper stewardship. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Judas was essentially arguing that the money should have been put into the treasury so he could steal it. This incident reveals something deeply disturbing about Judas' psychological state. He had become so skilled at deception that he could cloak his greed in the language of compassion. He could make theft sound like charity and selfishness sound like social concern. This wasn't just financial corruption anymore. This was moral corruption so complete that he had lost the ability to distinguish between his own desires and genuine righteousness. What's even more chilling is how convincing he must have sounded. The other disciples didn't push back against his criticism. They didn't roll their eyes or exchange knowing glances. As far as they could tell, Judas was simply being practical and compassionate. His reputation for financial responsibility was so solid that his words carried weight in their discussions. But Jesus saw through the facade completely. His response to Judas's criticism was swift and revealing, "Leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Jesus not only defended Mary's act of worship, but also made a prophetic reference to his coming death, a reality that Judas would soon play a crucial role in fulfilling. During these 3 years of ministry, while Judas was perfecting his art of deception, something else was happening that none of the disciples fully understood. Jesus repeatedly spoke about his coming death and resurrection. He warned them that he would suffer, be rejected by the religious leaders, and be killed. But these teachings seemed to bounce off the disciples like water off stone. They simply couldn't or wouldn't accept that their Messiah would die. For Judas, these predictions may have been particularly troubling. If he had indeed followed Jesus with political expectations, hoping for a revolutionary leader who would overthrow Rome and establish an earthly kingdom, then Jesus' talk of death and suffering would have been deeply disappointing. Where was the army? Where was the rebellion? Where was the crown and the throne? As the months passed and Jesus continued to speak of love, forgiveness, and sacrifice rather than conquest and revolution, Judas may have begun to question whether he had chosen the right leader to follow. The cognitive dissonance between his expectations and reality would have created enormous internal pressure. He had invested 3 years of his life in this movement, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Jesus had no intention of becoming the kind of Messiah that Judas wanted. Yet throughout this growing disillusionment, Judas maintained his position as treasurer and continued his pattern of theft. In fact, his stealing may have intensified as his faith in Jesus' mission diminished. If this movement wasn't going to result in political victory and personal advancement, then at least he could ensure his own financial security by skimming more from the treasury. The psychological profile that emerges is of a man caught between competing loyalties and desires. On one hand, he had witnessed undeniable miracles and experienced supernatural power flowing through his own ministry. On the other hand, his greed, political expectations, and growing disillusionment were creating a perfect storm of spiritual crisis. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Judas' hidden life was how completely he had compartmentalized his different identities. During the day, he could stand beside Jesus as a trusted apostle, participating in ministry and appearing devoted to the cause. In the evening, he could count stolen coins while his companions slept, calculating how much he could take without being detected. And all the while, he maintained relationships with people who trusted him completely. This level of psychological fragmentation suggests something deeper than mere greed or political disappointment. It points to a fundamental disconnect between Judas' public persona and his private reality, a split that would eventually tear his soul apart. He was living multiple lives simultaneously, and the tension between them was building toward an inevitable explosion. The other disciples remained completely oblivious to this internal warfare. When they looked at Judas, they saw a reliable teammate, a capable treasurer, and a fellow servant of Jesus. They had no idea that behind his familiar face was a man whose heart had already begun the journey toward betrayal. His deception was so complete that even when Jesus would later announce that one of them would betray him, their first response wouldn't be to suspect Judas, but to worry that it might be themselves. As we continue to unravel the mystery of Judas's secret life, we'll discover how his hidden struggles with money, politics, and identity would eventually collide with supernatural forces of darkness, leading to the most infamous betrayal in human history. This compartmentalized existence that Judas had perfected reveals something truly terrifying about the human capacity for self-deception. While his fellow disciples were wrestling openly with their doubts and failures, Judas had learned to bury his contradictions so deeply that even he may have lost sight of who he really was. Peter might deny Jesus 3 times in a moment of panic, but at least his betrayal would be followed by bitter tears and genuine repentance. Thomas might struggle with doubt, but his questions were honest and searching. Judas, however, had created a prison of lies so sophisticated that he had become both the jailer and the prisoner. The psychological mechanisms that allowed Judas to maintain this double life are the same ones that enable people today to live with profound moral contradictions. He had mastered the art of rationalization, convincing himself that his theft was somehow justified. Perhaps he told himself that he deserved compensation for his financial management skills. Maybe he reasoned that the other disciples didn't understand money the way he did, so taking a little extra was simply claiming his due. Or possibly he had convinced himself that Jesus' talk of poverty and sacrifice was naive, and that someone needed to be practical about securing their future. Whatever his internal justifications, Judas had developed what psychologists today would recognize as a narcissistic ability to rewrite reality to serve his own needs. He could sit through Jesus' teachings about honesty and integrity, while mentally calculating how much he could steal that week. He could participate in prayers about God's provision while simultaneously undermining that very provision through his theft. He could express concern for the poor while robbing them of resources intended for their care. But the most chilling aspect of Judas' deception wasn't what he was hiding from others. It was what he was hiding from himself. The human mind has an extraordinary capacity to protect the ego from uncomfortable truths, and Judas had weaponized this psychological defense mechanism. He had become so skilled at compartmentalization that he could genuinely feel righteous indignation when Mary wasted expensive perfume, even though he was actively stealing far more than the cost of that perfume from the group's treasury. This self-deception was so complete that Judas may have actually believed his own performance. When he criticized Mary's act of worship, the passion in his voice may have felt authentic to him. When he expressed concern for the poor, he may have experienced genuine emotion. This is the terrifying power of psychological compartmentalization taken to its extreme. You can become so divorced from your own actions that you lose the ability to recognize your own hypocrisy. The other disciples, meanwhile, continued to trust Judas completely. This wasn't because they were naive or stupid. It was because Judas had become a master manipulator, skilled at telling people exactly what they wanted to hear. He understood the dynamics of the group, knew which emotional buttons to push, and had learned to position himself as the voice of reason and responsibility. When financial decisions needed to be made, the others naturally deferred to his expertise. When questions arose about resource allocation, they trusted his judgment. He had successfully branded himself as the practical one, the fiscally responsible one, the disciple who understood how the real world worked. This manipulation extended beyond just financial matters. Judas had learned to read the emotional temperature of the group and adjust his responses accordingly. When the disciples were excited about Jesus' teachings, Judas would nod enthusiastically. When they expressed confusion or doubt, he would offer reassuring words. When they worried about their safety or their future, he would project confidence and stability. He had become a human chameleon, reflecting back to others whatever they needed to see to maintain their trust. But perhaps the most disturbing element of Judas' hidden life was how he had learned to manipulate Jesus himself. While the other disciples approached their teacher with genuine questions, struggles, and emotions, Judas had calculated exactly how to maintain his position without revealing his true nature. He never asked the probing questions that might expose his lack of real faith. He never expressed the doubts that might prompt Jesus to look too closely at his heart. He never showed the vulnerability that characterizes authentic spiritual growth. Instead, Judas had perfected the art of religious performance. He knew the right words to say, the right expressions to wear, and the right actions to take to maintain his facade. He could pray with apparent sincerity, participate in ministry with seeming devotion, and engage in spiritual discussions with convincing enthusiasm. But all of it was theater, carefully choreographed to protect his secret life and maintain his access to the resources he was stealing. This religious manipulation is particularly chilling because it reveals how someone can use spiritual language and behavior as tools of deception rather than expressions of genuine faith. Judas had learned to speak the language of discipleship fluently while remaining fundamentally unchanged by its message. He could quote Jesus' teachings while violating their spirit. He could participate in sacred rituals while harboring profane intentions. He had weaponized worship itself as a means of maintaining his deception. The tragedy of this spiritual fraud goes beyond just the money Judas stole. It represents a complete corruption of the relationship between teacher and student, between master and disciple. While the other apostles were being transformed by their proximity to Jesus, growing in faith, wisdom, and character despite their failures and setbacks, Judas was using that same proximity as cover for his increasingly elaborate deceptions. He was in the presence of divine love and truth every day, yet he had hardened his heart so completely that these forces couldn't penetrate his carefully constructed defenses. What makes this even more remarkable is that Jesus knew exactly what was happening. The Son of God, who could see into men's hearts and know their thoughts before they spoke them, was fully aware of Judas' theft, his deception, and his spiritual emptiness. Yet he continued to treat him with patience, kindness, and respect. He continued to include him in ministry opportunities. He continued to trust him with responsibilities. This wasn't divine naivety. This was a demonstration of love so profound that it extended even to those who were betraying it. Jesus' knowledge of Judas' true character raises profound questions about divine sovereignty and human free will. If Jesus knew that Judas would ultimately betray him, why did he choose him as an apostle? Why did he allow him to continue stealing? Why didn't he expose his deception to the other disciples? The answers to these questions reveal something crucial about how God works in human history and how he respects human choice, even when that choice leads to tragedy. The fact that Jesus allowed Judas to continue in his deception suggests that even divine love has boundaries when it comes to respecting human autonomy. God will not force transformation on someone who refuses it. He will not violate the free will that he himself has given to human beings. Judas had every opportunity to repent, to confess his theft, to acknowledge his spiritual emptiness, and ask for help. The same grace that transformed Peter after his denial, that changed Thomas from doubt to faith, that turned Paul from persecutor to apostle, was available to Judas every single day. But Judas had chosen a different path. He had chosen to harden his heart against conviction, to resist the transforming power of divine love, and to use his proximity to Jesus as an opportunity for personal gain rather than spiritual growth. Each day that he maintained his deception, each coin that he stole, each lie that he told, was another step away from the possibility of redemption. He was writing his own spiritual death sentence, one choice at a time. The other disciples, still unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst, continued to see Judas as a trusted brother and reliable colleague. They shared meals with him, laughed at his jokes, sought his advice on practical matters, and included him in their hopes and dreams for the future. They had no idea that the man they trusted with their resources was systematically robbing them, or that the colleague they respected for his practical wisdom was spiritually bankrupt. This blindness on the part of the other disciples wasn't a character flaw. It was actually a testament to their own integrity. They trusted Judas because they couldn't imagine doing what he was doing. Their own honesty made them unable to recognize his dishonesty. Their own genuine faith made them incapable of seeing through his performance. They were victims not of their own naivety, but of their own virtue. They trusted because they were trustworthy. They believed in Judas's goodness because they were good. As the months passed and Jesus' ministry approached its climax, the tension in Judas' double life began to intensify. The cognitive dissonance between his public role and private actions was creating enormous psychological pressure. The gap between what he appeared to be and what he actually was had grown so wide that maintaining the deception required increasingly sophisticated mental gymnastics. He was living on borrowed time, and somewhere deep in his consciousness, he must have known that his carefully constructed world was heading toward collapse. The religious and political environment around them was also becoming more volatile. The Jewish religious leaders were growing increasingly hostile toward Jesus, viewing his popularity and teachings as threats to their authority. The Roman occupation forces were always on edge, ready to crush any movement that might challenge their control. And among the Jewish people themselves, expectations were rising that the long-awaited Messiah would soon reveal himself and restore Israel's independence. Into this powder keg of competing expectations and rising tensions, Judas brought his own internal conflicts and hidden agendas. He was a man walking toward a moment of decision that would force him to choose between the facade he had maintained and the reality he had hidden. The collision between his secret life and his public role was inevitable, and when it came, it would not only destroy him, but would set in motion events that would change the course of human history forever. What makes Judas' story even more haunting is that he wasn't just deceiving his fellow disciples about money. He was deceiving them about something far more fundamental: his complete lack of genuine faith in Jesus as the Messiah. While the other disciples called Jesus Lord, acknowledging his divine authority, Judas consistently referred to him only as Rabbi, a title that recognized Jesus as nothing more than a teacher or religious instructor. This linguistic distinction reveals the chasm between Judas' public performance and his private beliefs. When Peter declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he was expressing a faith that would sustain him through his own failures and eventual martyrdom. When Thomas fell to his knees crying, "My Lord and my God," he was acknowledging a divine reality that would transform his entire worldview. But Judas never made such declarations. He never experienced such revelations. He remained spiritually unmoved by the very presence he was pretending to serve. Picture the profound loneliness of Judas' position. Every day, he was surrounded by men who were genuinely experiencing spiritual transformation, who were growing in faith and understanding, who were being changed from the inside out by their relationship with Jesus. And there he sat among them, untouched, unchanged, going through the motions while his heart remained cold and calculating. He was like a man attending a concert for music he couldn't hear, participating in a celebration for a reality he couldn't perceive. This spiritual deadness helps explain how Judas could witness miracle after miracle without being moved to genuine faith. He saw Jesus heal the sick, raise the dead, calm storms, and feed thousands with a few loaves and fishes. He participated in these supernatural events, even channeling divine power through his own hands during apostolic missions. Yet none of it penetrated the hardness of his heart or challenged his fundamental unbelief. For someone whose heart was truly open to God, such experiences would have been overwhelming, life-changing, impossible to ignore. But Judas had developed what can only be described as spiritual immunity. He had so thoroughly compartmentalized his life that even the miraculous became routine, even the divine became mundane. He was living proof that exposure to truth doesn't automatically produce transformation, that proximity to holiness doesn't guarantee personal change. As Jesus' ministry entered its final phase and the tension with religious authorities reached a breaking point, Judas found himself facing a crisis that would force him to make a definitive choice. The Jewish leaders were actively plotting against Jesus, looking for an opportunity to arrest him without causing a public uprising. They needed inside information, someone who knew Jesus' movements and could deliver him at a time and place where they could act without interference from the crowds, who still supported him. Into this volatile situation stepped Judas Iscariot, the trusted treasurer who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of deception. The man who had successfully fooled 11 disciples, who had maintained a facade of devotion while harboring unbelief, who had systematically stolen from his companions while expressing concern for the poor, was perfectly positioned to commit the ultimate betrayal. The 30 pieces of silver he would receive weren't just payment for information. They were the final transaction in a spiritual bankruptcy that had been years in the making. The man who had been stealing coins from the treasury would now sell his teacher for the price of a slave. The disciple who had criticized others for wasting money would now demonstrate the true depths of his own greed. The apostle who had spent 3 years living a lie would finally reveal his true nature to the world. But even as Judas walked toward his moment of infamy, even as he made contact with the chief priests and began planning his betrayal, there was still time for repentance. There were still opportunities for grace. The same Jesus who would soon wash Judas' feet at the Last Supper, who would offer him bread as a final gesture of love, who would call him friend even in the moment of betrayal, was still extending mercy to the man who was about to destroy him. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of Judas' story. He wasn't a victim of fate or divine predestination. He was a man who had spent 3 years hardening his heart against every opportunity for salvation, who had chosen deception over truth, greed over generosity, and ultimately betrayal over loyalty. His fall wasn't sudden or unexpected. It was the inevitable result of thousands of small choices that had led him away from light and into darkness. The secret life of Judas before his betrayal reveals something terrifying about the human capacity for self-deception and spiritual corruption. It shows us how someone can be in the very presence of divine love and remain untouched by it, how proximity to truth can coexist with fundamental dishonesty, and how religious performance can mask spiritual emptiness. But Judas' story also serves as a warning for all of us. It challenges us to examine our own hearts, to ask ourselves whether we are truly seeking transformation or simply maintaining appearances. Are we living with integrity, or are we compartmentalizing our lives in ways that allow sin to flourish in secret? Are we genuinely growing in faith, or are we simply getting better at religious performance? The man who betrayed Jesus wasn't a monster who appeared out of nowhere. He was a trusted friend whose secret life gradually corrupted his soul until he was capable of the unthinkable. His tragedy reminds us that the greatest spiritual dangers often come not from external enemies, but from the deceptions we allow to take root within our own hearts. In the end, Judas' secret life before his betrayal teaches us that character is forged in the hidden moments, in the choices we make when no one else is watching, in the integrity we maintain or abandon when it costs us something. His story is a sobering reminder that we are all capable of profound good or devastating evil, and that the difference between the two often lies in the small, seemingly insignificant decisions we make every single day. The next time you're tempted to compromise your integrity in secret, remember Judas. The next time you're considering a small deception that no one else will notice, think about the man who spent 3 years stealing from his friends while sitting at the feet of Jesus. Because the path to betrayal isn't marked by dramatic moments of rebellion. It's paved with tiny compromises that seem insignificant at the time, but eventually lead to destinations we never intended to reach. If this exploration into the hidden life of Judas has challenged your thinking or stirred something in your spirit, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts on how we can guard our hearts against the kind of spiritual deception that destroyed one of history's most infamous figures. And remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries and lessons of biblical history. Until next time, may we all choose the path of integrity over deception, transparency over performance, and genuine faith over religious pretense.